Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an idea that has shaped our modern world in ways you probably don't even realize: the Protestant theology of work. So let me start with a question for you. How do you really see your daily work? Is it just a grind, a necessary evil to pay the bills? Or is it something more, a meaningful vocation? Believe it or not, how you answer that has some really deep historical and theological roots.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the complex, sometimes contradictory ideas of Martin Luther. Then we'll see how his concept of vocation grew from that. We'll check out how modern theologians have responded, look at the big push to connect work and worship, and wrap up with the questions that are still on the table today.
Right. So our journey really begins with one man, Martin Luther. His thinking on work was an absolute game changer, but it was also just full of tension. You see, the first thing you've got to understand about Luther is his foundational idea, sola fide, which means faith alone. He argued that our actions, our good works, couldn't actually earn us salvation. This completely flipped the script on the value of daily labor. I mean, if your job doesn't save you, then what's it for? And right here, you can see the central conflict in his thinking, laid out side by side. On the one hand, Luther saw work as a punishment for sin, the toil and sweat that came after the fall. But then, on the other hand, he also points out that Adam worked in the Garden of Eden before any of that happened, which suggests work is actually part of God's original perfect design for us. So, which one is it? A curse or a blessing? This kind of back and forth pops up everywhere in his writings. He'd say you can pray while you work, but then insist that Sunday has to be kept totally free for public prayer. He criticized monks for being idle, but then turned around and argued clergy shouldn't have jobs so they could focus. It created this really complex legacy that, honestly, theologians are still trying to unpack centuries later.
But out of all that tension, one of the most powerful and lasting ideas of the Reformation started to take shape: the whole concept of vocation.
Theologians like James Hart really highlight just how radical Luther's idea was. The idea that any job, not just being a priest or a monk, could be a holy calling. A farmer, a blacksmith, a parent, all of their daily work could be sanctified, made holy. This was all tied to his core belief in the priesthood of all believers, the idea that everyone has a direct line to God. So even inside this positive new idea of vocation, you still see that duality. There's kind of the defensive view, work as a remedy against sin, keeping idle hands out of trouble. But then there's the much more proactive view, work as obedient service, a way to actively love and serve your neighbor. Okay, so let's fast forward a few centuries. Ever since Luther, theologians and historians have been grappling with his ideas, and they've taken them in some very, very different directions. And the responses have been incredibly diverse. You've got scholars like Rob Scarrow looking at it through a modern sociological lens, focusing on class and labor structures. Then you have others who challenge the whole timeline. I mean, was the Protestant work ethic really started by Protestants? Gies points to earlier medieval guilds, while Smith says, hang on, maybe it has more to do with 19th century American evangelicals than 16th century German reformers. The theologian Matata points out a pretty major imbalance, and this chart shows it perfectly. Luther's view of work is super heavy on the doctrine of creation, this idea that our work continues God's creative act. But there's way less focus on redemption, on how our work connects to the life and sacrifice of Christ. And that leaves a huge question hanging. Is our work just about making stuff, or is it also about healing and restoring a broken world? And that very gap has led a lot of contemporary thinkers to ask a really practical question. How do we connect our faith on Sunday to our actual labor on Monday? The American theologian Bene Rowley really nailed this when he identified the Sunday-Monday split as a central problem for so many people. It's this feeling of living a divided life, where your faith feels completely disconnected from your 9 to 5. He argued for a faith that integrates what happens in church with what happens in the office, the factory, or the field. And he is definitely not alone. There's this growing movement in Protestantism, sometimes called a liturgical turn, that's trying to rediscover this spiritual dimension of work. Thinkers like these are arguing that our labor isn't just a task to be completed, but a form of worship that finds its ultimate meaning in celebration. So, where does all of this leave us? Well, Luther kicked off a profound conversation about faith and work, but it's a conversation that is, it's far from over. The conversation seems to be moving forward by tackling 3 main challenges. First,
getting beyond a purely social view of work to find its deeper, transcendent meaning. Second, bridging that gap we saw earlier, connecting our work as creators with the work of redemption. And finally, figuring out how our daily work, the guiding word of Scripture, and our communal worship all fit together into one seamless life of faith.
So, this whole legacy isn't some settled argument sitting in a museum. No, it's a living tradition. It's an ongoing project with big questions that still resonate with us today. And that brings us right back to you and to the question we started with. After thinking about this whole journey, from punishment to vocation to worship, how might you see your own work a little differently? Could it be more than just a job and instead a calling that connects you to something much, much greater? That's it for this explainer. Thanks for joining us.